Good morning. Today is February 19th. It's also President's Day. And my topic really concerns itself. I'm trying to make some sense out of this mess of international institutions that are participating in the events in the Middle East and elsewhere. It is such a large and varied range of institutions and stuff. So I thought I would try to see whether I can't isolate some trees out of this forest, which may help us understand both what can and cannot be done internationally about the Middle East. But before I do so, I guess I want to spend 2 seconds on the demise of Navalny. It is both very sad and it is forefront of everybody's attention. I'm sure you've heard and read about it, so I won't belabor the issue. He probably was well aware that he might die in prison. On the other hand, he might have had a hope, and the hope was that he could emerge at some point when the government changes in Russia as a kind of Nelson Mandela of South Africa, who spent decades imprisoned and then, of course, became the post-apartheid leader for some years. And I wouldn't be surprised if lurking in the back of Navalny's mind was the best case scenario. He would someday emerge as a national leader who was viable and could be supported. Anyway, it is very sad, but there we are. And I think it is of interest internationally that people are speaking up and that people are paying attention, which calls attention both to the US and US policy and, of course, Putin and Putin's policy. So let me get to international institutions. There are essentially two types. One are intergovernmental institutions, where the members of the organizations are governments, and then there are non-governmental organizations where the membership varies. Some are special and located in individual countries. Others are very international. I'll talk about all of this in a minute. Obviously, for us nowadays, the intergovernmental organizations are at the forefront of everybody's attention. On the one hand, the United Nations, right? And on the other hand, regional intergovernmental organizations, for example, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the European Union leap to mind as the strongest possible and most visible to us in the media, although there are lots of other intergovernmental organizations aside from the United Nations, and there are lots of regional or special subject intergovernmental organization. It's not, there are other common markets in the world, Latin America, Africa, and so forth. So the typology of this matters because when you imagine that some of these institutions should do something, you have to ask whether or not the to do something has to be done by governments who agree to have their organizations of which they're members act, or whether or not it's the policy of essentially a private organization made up of private individuals. Now, the United Nations, of course, leaps to mind as the main intergovernmental organization. Almost all countries of the world belong to the United Nations. We are all aware of the organs, the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Economic Commission, and the International Court of Justice. Those are sort of, if you look at a map, and you probably have at some point, or even when you were in school, you looked at these maps, these are the sort of core of the institutions. And then surrounding those institutions are a lot of intergovernmental UN-related institutions that deal with special subjects. For example, the International Atomic Energy Agency, for example, the Food and Agriculture Organization, name the top UNESCO scientific and educational institution. And all of these specialized UN institutions are intergovernmental, are funded by governments, and deal with special subjects of their membership or of interest to their membership. One of the organizations we probably have read a lot about recently is WHO, World Health Organization, because they played a big role during COVID, and they're playing a role in terms of the situation, the medical situation in Gaza, right? But they're part of the UN structure. Now, the UN, of course, is it came into being after the Second World War, but its precursor was, of course, the League of Nations after the First World War. And some of the institutions are similar to what came into being after the First World War, and others are, brand new, addressing 20th century, 21st century issues. What has been the focus recently has, of course, been the Security Council, and why, for example, can't they vote for a ceasefire in the Middle East, for example? And the reason, of course, is that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council have a veto power, and the other states that are elected for a shorter term, 2 years, whatever, the all total 15 right now, I believe, don't have a veto power. But if one of the veto powering countries vetoes something, the Security Council can't act. And this has been a huge disabling characteristic. Now, I think in our American psyche, the veto or building in a veto power into the Charter of the United Nations was a Russian idea, because in the 50s and 60s, almost all the vetoes in the Security Council to do anything came from the Soviet Union. Actually, that's not true. Actually, the US insisted on the veto power when the charter discussions took place. And they insisted on it because they wanted to get the support of the US Congress, which said that, the US can't give away sovereignty over issues. In any event, given the Middle East situation, it is the US that has been vetoing actions by the United Nations because of its support for Israel. So then the other institution, namely the General Assembly, has gotten into the act, and they have voted in support of, cessation of conflict and so on. But of course, they don't have the leverage that the Security Council has. So in some senses, it is true that the General Assembly both condemned the actions of Hamas, but also is condemning what the Israelis are doing in Gaza. But it's just basically talk. They can't much act. And unless the US either abstains or decides to vote in favor of something that Israel may disapprove of, the UN is pretty much stuck. The Secretary General of the UN, has of course spoken out. There's one other branch of the United Nations which has spoken up, and that is the International Criminal Court, which, by the way, its origins go back into the late 19th century, became incorporated into the League of Nations and became incorporated into the United Nations. It's located in The Hague. But the reason I'm boring you with those details is to say that you may recall a few weeks ago that South Africa brought a case against Israel as having violated international law of war, genocide, and so forth, to the International Court of Justice, and they're deliberating on it, and I won't bore you with that today. But the question is, why was it possible to bring Israel or charge Israel in front of the International Court of Justice and not Hamas. And the reason is that Hamas is not a state, and only states can bring cases to the International Court of Justice. There is another international court, and that's the International Criminal Court, of which, by the way, we're not a member. That's a complicated story in and of itself, but we cooperate. And the international cases can be bought, and they probably will be bought down the line against Hamas, because individuals can be brought. The former military head of state of Chile was brought in front of the International Criminal Court. Milosevic from Yugoslavia was brought and in fact convicted by the International Criminal Court. So it's useful to keep in mind that there's sort of two mechanisms of international court. One, only states can bring action, and the other, actions can be brought against individuals. Okay, so that is a dividing line. There are, as I said, many more localized and regionalized international mechanisms. NATO has been at the forefront. NATO membership are states, right? And they're the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, European states and the United States and Canada. And there has been much in the news about new membership of states. And if you have questions, sometimes we should talk about those, including the fact that there was, vetoes against the idea of bringing, for example, Finland and Sweden, who are not members of NATO, into NATO. And Turkey, more or less on behalf of Russian pressure, and others have argued that those countries, one of the countries that argued against the membership of those two countries was Hungary, which is an authoritarian state inside of NATO. So that gets all very complicated, and I don't mean to bore you with the details, but you can tell that one of the most vibrant and vital intergovernmental institutions right now is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is trying to protect Europe from any incursions into Europe by, for example, Russia. The thing to know, and I'm sure you heard it in the news, is that what is unique and distinctive about NATO is that an attack on one is an attack on all, right? And that is what Trump raised the other day when he said that if Putin wants to attack one of the NATO countries, he should feel free to go ahead if, for example, they haven't paid as much money into NATO as they're supposed to. He should just be free to go ahead. Well, if he went free and did something in one of the NATO memberships, all of NATO, including the United States, would be treaty bound to get into the act, and we would have a world war. So this is the fact that in the case of NATO, you can an attack on one obliges the military machinery of both NATO in terms of headquarters, but also NATO in terms of the military of all member countries to get in the act to protect the country that was attacked. Ironically, the only time that one of the members of NATO was attacked and theoretically all of NATO needed to respond was in favor of us at 9/11. We may have forgotten that. When 9/11 went down, all NATO countries had to be activated in potential defense of the United States. So that only to say, if beyond even the Ukraine, which would like to be a member of NATO but is not as yet, even if let's say the Russians move into Moldova or one of the East European countries, Poland or something, it will activate the entire membership of NATO, and we will have a huge war on our hands. The European Economic Community, again, covers lots of countries. It just deals with economic effects, but it too is a very important and vibrant organization, and we can talk some more about this. Now then, I'm just sort of bumping around to sort of highlight some of the stuff that's been in the news recently. But then you get to the non-governmental organization, and the world is full of them. They are privately funded. Often governments also fund them, but governments are not members of those organizations. So, for example, the International Red Cross, which has been in the news a lot, is originally a Swiss organization. It's privately funded, meaning governments are not members, even though governments contribute to it, to the funding of them. And you might have noticed that with respect to the Middle East and Gaza, there's also always discussion of the Red Crescent. The Red Crescent is a part of the International Red Cross. And the reason is that, of course, on the flag and the symbol of the International Red Cross is a cross which looks Christian, right, to Muslims. And so the idea became that rather than flying the flags with a Christian cross, Muslim countries could fly it with a Muslim crescent. Right? So the Red Crescent is part of the International Red Cross, but it just has a different name in Muslim countries. They have, of course, been very active, but so have Doctors Without Borders, which is lodged in France, but is all over the world and is busy trying to deal with things. So are various charitable food organizations. And the problem for Gaza right now is that while all of these international non-governmental organizations require huge amounts of funds to help countries like Gaza, they're essentially barred by Israel from doing very much of anything in those countries. Israel controls the borders. Israel controls what they may or may not do. And as you might have noticed on the news, these non-governmental international organizations trying to help the civilian population in Gaza are stymied in many ways of helping. They are also, have supplied huge numbers of doctors in the hospitals. For example, in Gaza, many of those doctors, some of those doctors have actually been killed, but many of those doctors have now returned to home bases, wherever they came from, simply because it's too dangerous, simply because the hospitals have closed down. So the medical situation in Gaza has sharply declined. Now, one part of the alphabet soup that's always in the news is UNRA, United Nations Relief Organization. And UNRWA is a kind of a strange animal because UNRWA was founded not as a specialized agency of the the UN, but as a separate agency after the conflict that created Israel. And so many Palestinians became refugees, had to move, and so forth. So UNRWA was created as a specialized agency, funded a sort of arm of the United Nations, but not a specialized agency, but a kind of a unique agency, which was supposed to help and manage the Palestinian refugees. As you may know, that after 48, not only did Palestinians move into Gaza, but they also, in heavy numbers, became refugees in Jordan, for example. And those countries were sufficiently poor, and still are in some ways, that they needed financial help, housing help, all kinds of help for the Palestinian refugees. So Palestinians are really spread throughout various parts of the Middle East, not just in Gaza. And of course, some Palestinians actually continue to live in Israel, and 20% of the Israeli population is not Jewish. They are Muslims, Palestinians, Druids, all kinds of people who have been essentially treated as second-class citizens in Israel. In recent years, got a little representation in the parliament there, but basically stayed in Israel, identify themselves as Israelis, but they're non-Jewish Israelis. And actually, I think most observers would say they have suffered a lot within Israel. Obviously, in some ways, better off than the refugees outside of Israel, but nevertheless. So theoretically, a lot of the networks from the International Red Cross through Doctors Without Borders, through international food organizations, through national organizations that are not governmental organizations, but are trying to help people around the world, and refugee organizations, are all potentially involved in the Palestinian situation and have been for decades, and are potentially important for the future of Gaza, but are not able to operate very much there because of the Israelis trying to root out Hamas. For example, there are almost no functioning hospitals anymore in Gaza. And the question is, what to do about some of these patients. Many of them just die in hospital or never get to hospital. Some actually have been lifted out into Egypt, but only very few of them have been able to get out. And what the future of the whatever Gazan population that is left at the end of it might be in terms of getting help from the intergovernmental organizations, the plethora of UN specialized agencies, and the non-governmental organization is an open question, because if you have eventually, if you had a two-state solution, of course, they could get the kind of help that any other state might be able to attract and help. If, on the other hand, Gaza continues to be under Israeli occupation, that may or may not be feasible. So, what about the neighbors? For example, Egypt. Well, Egypt is a sovereign country and doesn't particularly want to get stuck with the better part of 2 million Gazan refugees. Although there are currently discussions of some kind of interregnum, cessation of bombardment of Gaza, and whether or not Egypt would be willing to set up a tent city for the refugees. Bear in mind that the population of Gaza was a little bit over 2 million people, 2.3 or something. By now, over 30,000 people have been killed, of which it's excess of 60% are women and children. So we have a human disaster on our hands. And while Israel justifies its actions because of the killing and capturing of Israelis, and it says it is going to root out Gaza, the Hamas out of Gaza, most observers, and I would include myself, sitting here in Santa Cruz, believe that this is not possible and this is not viable. Now, in the attempt of trying to do something about getting some kind of temporary peace or permanent solution for Palestinians, one says, well, isn't that why the UN exists? Yes, the UN exists, but the UN only exists if the Security Council can act, or at least try to act, and you don't get a veto in the Security Council, and so far that has not taken place. Although my guess is that the next time something comes around the Security Council, the US may abstain and let it go through without actually joining the vote. But that's just a guess on my part. There is another, I know I'm jumping around, but there is another wrinkle to all of this, and that is that the folks that are trying to negotiate some kind of peace treaties, quite aside from intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, is in fact the country of Qatar. Qatar is a tiny little country. It's got population of just a little bit over 2 million people. It also happens to house the largest American military base in the region. And Qatar has been, playing all sides. That is to say, Qatar has been in communications and has helped Hamas. But Qatar has also, of course, been allied with the US, and for that matter, even Israel. And one of the little understood aspects of this is that Israel, prior to the current nightmare and mess in Gaza, has actually welcomed Qatar helping Hamas a little bit, the current government of Israel, and funding Hamas a little bit. And the reason is that the right-wing government of Israel found it in its interest to have Hamas and sort of stirring the pot and some more radical group of people in Gaza, because that staved off any serious discussion of a two-state solution. As long as you had a terrorist group in Gaza, you obviously weren't going to have a two-state solution. And since Israel, at least the right in Israel, has not wanted this two-state solution, Israel actually played footsie with Qatar to help the Hamas a little bit along the line, so that they could stir the pot. Of course, not anticipating the Hamas attack on Israel, and that's a separate story. Should they have known? Yes, they should have known. Did somebody in Israel know that an attack was planned? Yes, they did. They didn't imagine it would be as bad as it was, and all the rest of it. You have no doubt read. The reason I'm raising this is not only in terms of the future of what will happen to the Palestinians and will there ever be a two-state solution, but also to highlight why it is that Qatar is playing such a large negotiating role in trying to get a temporary peace, or at least a cessation of conflict in Gaza. Because it has in its midst some of the leadership of Hamas. At the same time, it has relationships with the United States, and through the United States with the UN and other agencies. And so this pipsqueak little Qatar is playing an outside role. I mean, we hear mention Egypt, for example, and that is understandable. Egypt is a major country and would be a useful partner in trying to figure out what to do about Gaza. But it might have puzzled, maybe not all of you, some of you, why is Qatar, of all places, so involved? Well, they have been playing with footsie, so to speak, with all the partners in all of this. And the ironic thing is that not only have they been supportive of Hamas and have some of the Hamas leadership, as I said, in their midst, but they've also at various times were in coordination with Israel to give some support to Hamas before this conflict, so that Hamas would continue to be a threat. And as long as Hamas was a threat in Gaza, even discussing a two-state solution didn't make any sense either for the right-wing government of Israel, but even many of the Israelis. Now, I've just, been rambling on about this, that, and the other thing, and I hope you didn't find it totally incoherent, but I just wanted to sort of poke around a little bit of the incredible complexity, many actors, non-state actors, state actors, global organizations, regional organizations. It is a very complex world out there. And when you have a conflict like Ukraine, when you have a conflict like the Middle East conflict right now, all kinds of actors play all kinds of roles. And the combination and groups of actors that get involved in any particular conflict or in any particular time in a conflict, for example, trying to negotiate a cessation or at least a temporary halt in the conflict in Gaza, gets to be very complex. And you might want to scratch your head and saying, so why is X involved or Y involved? And my explanation is it is a very big network of organizations, privately funded, publicly funded, with different alliances, often having alliances with countries that are in conflict with each other. For example, Hungary, a close ally of, in many ways, of Russia, while at the same time being a member of the EU, etc. It is a very complex and messy world out there. And if you have specific questions, please email me, and I will have a more focused topic the next time. But I thought I would poke around this mess a little bit today. Thank you very much, and see you in 2 weeks.